everybody, it's Rosemary. As promised, this week I'm going to talk about something cultural. If you've been following the channel at all, you may know that I've written a book called The Dirty Girl Coming of Age in a Hoarding Household. I am going to divide this cultural discussion into at least two videos, probably this week and next week. I'm thinking about hoarding and the fact that hoarding disorder is an anxiety disorder. So I'm thinking about two components of hoarding disorder. There's the psychological component, the anxiety that drives the compulsive behavior, and separately from that, the behavior itself, the hoarding behavior. And I think next week I'm going to talk about the anxiety part and how it might relate to culture. I mean, I have personally some views about aspects of culture in the United States that I think kind of stoke anxiety. So I have an essay that I've written on this topic that I will post on my website, and I will put a link to it in the description below. So probably this video, a lot of it could be considered like an abbreviated version of that essay, but I go into more detail there if you're interested. And I wrote that essay a few years ago, but I edited it and added a lot of things a few months ago after I watched a documentary that really I cannot recommend enough. It's called Schooling the World, the White Man's Last Burden. I wish everyone in the world would watch this documentary. I will also try to find a link to that and put that in the description below. It will blow your mind, and I think challenge the notions that you have about things like education and helping others, less fortunate people, because actually maybe those people are not less fortunate. Well, anyway, I could go on about that forever, but I need to go forward with this topic. So I'm going to be saying some things that could give someone the mistaken impression that I am against capitalism and against Western culture. So let me just say right now, I'm a product of capitalism and Western culture, and I like who I am, and I enjoy shopping, and I enjoy having all kinds of new wonderful products available to me all the time, and I'm not against capitalism, and I'm not against any culture, mine or anyone else's. I think all of them have good things and bad things about them. So let me just put that disclaimer out there right now. But I do think it's a healthy thing for us to examine our own cultures so that we can then decide for ourselves which parts of our culture we want to celebrate and which we might want to tweak a little bit or swap out for other things. Okay, so I'm not hating on Western culture or capitalism. So I grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, and I was looking a little bit into the history of that part of the world. And you know, in the early 19th century, Kansas was Indian territory. And there were different tribes who actually had fled from the east as the United States advanced ever westward. And this was, you know, yet another place where Native Americans were supposed to have some land set aside for them outside of the jurisdiction of the United States. And of course, we know that, you know, these treaties were pretty much lies and kept being broken over and over again, because Kansas is no longer Indian territory now, other than, you know, maybe a reservation here or there. So the Shawnee were one people who were pushed continually westward and fought wars with the United States, famously led by Tecumseh, more often pronounced Tecumseh. And Tecumseh had a brother named Tenskwatawa, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and he became a prophet. And if you look him up on the internet, you can find all sorts of quotes attributed to him, and I do not agree with everything he ever said. But he did say one thing that I include in my book that I find eerily predictive, sadly so, of what ended up happening when my ancestors moved into Kansas. So here's something Tenskwatawa supposedly said. Beyond the great sunrise water, there lived a people who had iron and those dirty and unnatural things, who seethed with diseases, who fought to death over the names of their gods. They had so crowded and befouled their own island that they fled from it, because excrement and carrion were up to their knees. They came to our island. They saw how much room we had and wanted it. They brought iron and pigs and wool and rum and disease. They came farther and drove us over the mountains. Then, when they had filled up and dirtied our old lands by the sea, they looked over the mountains and saw this middle ground, and they started rushing into it. So, Tenskwatawa has this concept of Europeans as people who came across this great sunrise water because on their island, Europe, they had made it so dirty that everywhere you walked there was like animal carcasses and shit up to your knees. And I think this may have been a bit of an exaggeration, but there were problems with sanitation in Europe, and there were overcrowding problems, and that wasn't the only factor, but that was one factor in the migration to the Americas, I believe. And having seen these Europeans move in to Shawnee traditional territory, and having seen what happened to that land, he describes it as these Europeans filled up and dirtied the land that they came into. And then they want, new, fresh, empty land, so they keep moving westward so they can fill up and dirty even more places. My grandfather lived in Shawnee, Kansas when I was a child, and now that's a name on the map. And the people living in Shawnee, Kansas are no longer Shawnees. And in my family, when my mother at that time was suffering from hoarding disorder, we were there in what had once been Shawnee Town. And in our little piece of former Shawnee Town, we definitely filled up and dirtied our little piece of that land, our house in Turner, Kansas. And it just kind of blows my mind that this guy, 150 years before I was born, could have predicted that. Nobody was talking about hoarding disorder in 1830. There was no DSM manual in 1830. And yet, I think he really was a prophet because he correctly predicted what happened. So I think this is one indication that the practice of hoarding can be associated maybe more strongly with some cultures than others. Or maybe we should be talking about economies rather than cultures. Okay, let me give you a different example from my own life as an adult. Moving around. So, as I mentioned previously, I think I do research with Zapotec languages in southern Oaxaca. And there's one ranch in particular I'm thinking of that I've done some field work. It's a place where electricity only arrived about 10 years ago, and parts of it only got electricity within the last couple years. And there's about 30 households. There is one family who does sell some things like maybe Cokes and chips, and I don't even know if they have a refrigerator. And they acquire that stuff in another town and sell it. There was, when I was there, like one person who had a telephone, and there would be like a small business for them because other people would pay to use that telephone. And there was a primary school. And other than that, it's just people in their homes and farming. And it's kind of a ways away. You have to, during the rainy season, you can't get a car all the way there. And to other parts of it, you can never get a car all the way there. There are parts that you have to like walk on a trail through the woods. There's, you might encounter all sorts of things from killer bees to pumas and jaguars. And I mean, it's the forest. And so it's somewhat remote. It's not the Amazon where some friends of mine work, but still it is somewhat remote. So you have to make a lot of effort to get there and to bring anything into there. All right, so the first time I went to do field work in this location, you know, since I grew up in a hoarding house, I'm kind of naturally interested in how people deal with garbage, and not just interested, but kind of nervous and insecure about it. Like in any context, it doesn't matter if I'm like in the home of a wealthy family in Marin County, California, or if I'm in a village with no electricity. No matter where I am in the world, I always have this feeling like I don't know what to do with the garbage, because I grew up in this house where nobody threw anything away, and other people know how to deal with that, not me. And so I always get really nervous, and I'm always like, oh, you know, what should I do? I always ask for specific instructions, you know, where should I throw this away? And I'm always paying extra attention to make sure I do the right thing, because I always think I'm going to do the wrong thing. So so they told me that if it's organic garbage, I could just throw it on the side of the hill and it'll decompose naturally, and that'll be good for the soil even. And maybe animals will eat it and stuff like that. And if it's not organic garbage, then they had a bag. So this bag, a large bag, was hanging from, I think, a palm tree. And so they say, oh, if you have something to throw away, go over there and throw it in that bag. So like the first day, I think when I arrived from Puerto Escondido, that day I had gotten a Coke, like a plastic 600 milliliter bottle of Coke. And I was still nursing that Coke when I arrived in this village. And so when I was done with that, that might have been the first thing I threw away, and I threw it away into this bag. And what they do is they wait until the bag kind of fills up, and then they burn it all. But the thing I noticed is that not many things go into that bag. Not much is inorganic garbage that is just going to be disposed of. And what I did notice is a lot of the garbage is organic, but also things that in my culture we would think of as garbage and dispose of after using them one time for the intended use, they find a way to use. So like I threw that Coke bottle away. I threw away, I had, I get chronic, or I did at that time get chronic migraines, and there were these, like dissolvable pills I used to take, Max Salt, and they had a horrible, wasteful packaging system. I mean, it was convenient, but it wasn't good for the environment. Like it would be this hard plastic case, and there were only like 3 or 5 pills that would come in that case, and the pharmacist would give me a new case every time. It's like, why do we need to be making this hard plastic case for just, 3 times that I took a pill? So anyway, I went through the last pill in that case while I was there. So I threw away this, hard plastic case. And I'm trying to think what else I might have thrown away. Well, I would notice sometimes, I would go to throw something away, and then I would notice that like something I had thrown away earlier in the day or the day before was not there anymore. And then I would start seeing that these things were actually being used. So this hard plastic case that my migraine pills came in, a 10-year-old boy was now using it to store all his crayons. So it was really good that he found a use for that, and it didn't have to be wasted. And that Coke bottle that I had thrown away, one day, the man of the house showed up, and he was really happy, and he had the Coke bottle, and he had trapped all these flying ants in it. There are these flying ants that in Spanish they're called chicatanas. In the Zapotec language of this village, they're called mbias, and they actually make a salsa out of them, like a salty, savory salsa. And I'll tell you a little secret. Well, it's not a secret because I don't really have secrets, but you know what I mean. So I kind of have a thing about eating insects. And in Mexico, especially in Oaxaca, it's like, pre-Columbian cuisine that has survived to this day. People eat grasshoppers, and, there's a number of different insects that are eaten in Mexico. And I have a thing about it because since I grew up in a hoarding household, there were many times that I accidentally had cockroaches in my mouth, like, grabbing a Coke thinking it was the current fresh Coke, and it turned out it would be a Coke that had sat there for a week and had a bunch of dead cockroaches floating in it, and I'd get a mouthful of cockroaches. Hope you weren't eating lunch while you were watching this video. Well, so I don't like the idea of eating insects on purpose. But I have eaten this salsa made of these flying ants, and I have to admit that it is really delicious. Anyway, so my host had found a way to use this Coke bottle to trap the flying ants, which then were made into the salsa. I didn't actually see him do it. I should go back and ask to watch next time. But you know, maybe they have maybe they come out of a narrow opening, and he could like put the Coke bottle right up to the opening, possibly. So so anyway, he had trapped them using the Coke bottle. And I would notice other things that in my culture people would probably throw away that they would use, you know, so like I would, in the outhouse, I noticed that like there were old school notebooks, like say maybe one of the children had a notebook from the previous school year that was all done with and was no longer being used, and they had filled it up, you know, and done all the math problems, and all that was over and in the past now, and that was used for toilet paper. So things that we wouldn't think about and we would just throw away in this context were actually being used, which I think is really good and much less wasteful and much better for the environment. So one day on this ranch, we were shucking corn, and you know, we're removing the kernels from the corn cob. And so I finished my first one, and then I had the bare corn cob left over. So I thought, oh, well, this is organic garbage because I've now removed all the edible part. And so now I should throw this away. And they told me that organic garbage, you throw it on the side of the hill. So I stood up and I walked over to the side of the hill to throw this away. I think I was probably the first person done because I hadn't seen what someone else did. So I just assumed this was garbage, and I went to throw it on the side of the hill. And they sent this little girl running after me. No, 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 that's not garbage. Don't throw that away. And they said, no, you can throw it in the chicken coop because the chickens will peck at that. There are still little pieces of corn on the corn cob, and the chickens can eat from that. And even once the chickens have pecked that cob to, you know, till there's nothing edible left on it, that corn cob can actually still be used. You can like use it as a cork in different kinds of bottles. There are other uses for these corn cobs, and people in Mesoamerica know how to use corn to the max. So, and in fact, in traditional Zapotec religion, it would really be considered a sin to waste any part of the corn plant that could still be used, because that's like a gift from the gods. So I was actually making this big mistake by throwing it away. And something that struck me is that this conversation that I had with a little girl who was sent to correct me is actually, in essence, the same conversation that you would see on these shows like Hoarders. Every time that conversation happens, it's part of the formula. The psychologist or the professional organizer is talking to the hoarder, and the hoarder says, but I don't want to throw this away. This is useful. This can still be used. This object has a purpose. And then the whole audience is meant to think that the hoarder is crazy for thinking they can use it because it just looks like trash. And the psychologist is then pushing and saying, but are you really going to use it? Will you really? You have all these things here and you've had them for 20 years and you haven't used them. Will you really use this object? And so the hoarder is, you know, we're supposed to understand that the hoarder is wrong because the evidence is clear to all of us that the hoarder is not going to use that object. But in this other case on this ranch, it was the opposite. I was the one saying, oh, this has no use, let's throw it away. And I was wrong in that cultural context. The person who was right was the little girl saying, no, this has a use. So what is the difference? The difference is that the people on this ranch, in this Zapotec-speaking village, will really use those things. They will use the corn cob, they will use the migraine pill container, they will use the math homework from a year ago, they will use the Coke bottle, all these things that we would throw away and think are useless garbage, they actually will use, so they're right to keep those things. And The hoarder really is not going to use all that stuff. And in a place where you have to carry everything in on a donkey, you know, you have to work to produce most of the things that you have. Maybe if you have a wooden chair, maybe you made it yourself by chopping down a tree and carving and cutting and, you know, nailing and whatever you have to do to make a chair. If you have a hammock, maybe you spent hours and hours weaving that hammock out of fiber that you got by, you know, stripping a particular plant apart and getting the fiber out of it and washing it out in a river and doing all these things. So in that place, you have to either do hard manual labor to create something, or you have to travel outside your community, make a difficult journey back in, perhaps with the help of a beast of burden to carry whatever it is, and you have to spend money to acquire things in the outside world, and maybe you don't have a lot of money because you're mostly growing your own food, and maybe you're selling some cash crops like coffee, but you're not making as much money as somebody who lives in an urban environment doing something else, and so your ability to acquire items in the consumer economy is limited. So that means that in that environment, everything that they get access to, that they acquire, that they create, they use, because it's hard to get those things. But if you're living in the United States, even if you are, you know, the working poor of the United States, it's pretty easy to acquire stuff. It's pretty easy to acquire a Coke bottle. Most people have cars in the United States. Not everybody, but most people. They don't have to get a donkey to carry everything. They don't have to carry everything on their back or with a tumbler. And credit cards exist. And it's pretty easy to acquire all kinds of stuff in the United States. And frankly, the prices are cheaper than in other countries for imported goods because of the complicated, you know, trade policies that exist. So, someone living in a Zapotec-speaking community like the kind I described is perfectly capable of experiencing anxiety, just like someone in the United States might feel anxiety about things going on in their life. A common way that humans try to cope with anxiety is through compulsive behavior. If you have the ability to easily shop and acquire things, then that is a compulsion that you are more likely to develop than if you live in a place where acquiring things is hard. You might develop some other compulsion in that context. But in a place like the United States, shopping is really a part of our culture. It's something, we no longer shop most of the time to survive or even necessarily improve the quality of our life. A lot of times we're shopping in order to like create an identity for ourselves. A lot of it is like a mental exercise. You know, you see yourself in a beautiful dress and you imagine having a certain kind of life, which maybe is not the life you have. You imagine going to glamorous parties or whatever and being the life of the party in this beautiful dress, and you know, you're creating this image of who you want to be, how you want people to see you. You know, the marketing plants certain images in your head. I go into more detail in the essay about this. We could go on about this for a whole video, but you know, if you're from that culture and watching this, which if you speak English, you've probably at least had contact with that, well, you probably know what I'm talking about. Like, we have a term, retail therapy. That says something right there, that we think it's a form of therapy. So, shopping is part of the culture, and then if you have anxiety, you might over-participate in this cultural practice of shopping. Okay, I have a lot more to say on the subject, but this video is already long, like all my videos are, and so I'm going to end it here. But remember, I'm going to put a link to this essay in the description, as well as to this documentary that I highly recommend, and there's a lot of insights in that documentary about subsistence economies versus consumer economies. And I'm thinking about maybe I might make a Spanish version of this video, because I think since I'm talking about a place in Mexico. I think it's relevant to a Mexican audience, and I can say some things in Zapotec, but I probably couldn't make a whole complex video about my thoughts about the consumer economy in Zapotec. So I will make a video probably in Spanish and upload it. Maybe if I get around to it in the next day or two, we'll see. So check all that out. And if you're interested in this topic, and next week we can talk about the emotional side of this and what I think are cultural triggers for anxiety in different cultures. Okay, I hope you're enjoying your week, and I will see you next time. Bye.